So the last instructional strategy we're going to talk about is another one I think is extremely important. Of course, I think they're all important, but this is one I feel is really important for just creating a culture of math appreciation in our classrooms, which is using errors as learning opportunities. And I say that because math is looked at as a very right or wrong subject. And usually when we have right or wrong in our minds, it's also associated with success or failure. Like those are the only options. And there are many options in between for math. And showing a student and helping a student to understand that can go a long way with how they feel about the math, how they feel about the subject, and how they receive information when we're trying to give the concepts to them. Because if they already, you mentioned before about students coming in and already feeling defeated, and a lot of times in math classes, that's how students come. They either feel completely defeated or they feel like, oh, I'm good at math and I know how to do this. And I think approaching errors and being intentional about what does it look like in my classroom when mistakes are made? How do I approach those? Do I take that as an opportunity to help a student with their reasoning skills and seeing this as an opportunity to learn from it? Because when you do take that approach, I believe that you are giving the students an idea of how to come out from under a wrong answer before just giving up. And this is going to allow them it's going to help their endurance when they're working independently and when they're working on those summative state tests or unit tests. So how do you use the idea of errors as learning opportunities?
Okay, when it comes to errors as learning opportunities, again, it's somewhere that you also have to be very intentional in your teaching approach. A lot of times, of course, I always start off a unit with taking the test myself so I can try to anticipate student errors. When you do that, you're also providing yourself opportunities to be able to project error analysis questions for students and ask them, where do you find the mistake? Where would you have done it differently? You also encourage the community to speak, not necessarily the teacher say, but that's not right. Let's try it again. No, I want the students to encourage each other to communicate and to discuss and say, little Johnny, when you did it right here, I didn't do mine that way. This is how I did it. Okay. So, you got to foster the classroom community to be more accepting to one another, to differences, and to helping each other work those differences out. Because again, we learn from each other. And so I think that's really important. You have to be intentional as well as making sure students are writing their work down. And every student is not great at writing, but if one student is better at always communicating his math problems, you can put him beside a peer or, have your instructional assistant write down the steps as he's working. Because as a teacher, we always have to reflect at every moment. And for a student that is not a person that writes, you still need to be able to think about how they're thinking, whether you have time to do it then or later. So I would always say have some type of way to have it where you can go back and think about what steps they see later. So be intentional with their scratch work. Okay. So one strategy that I use is I teach all my students every single time they have to do some problems, they have to write it down, all their work. And intentionally, what I have them do is I take their sheet of paper, whether it's in their notebook or test or whatever the case may be, a scratch sheet of paper, notebook paper. They're going to do a hot dog fold and a couple of hamburger folds. So it ends up like this. Mm-hmm. And what they'll end up having are 8 squares on the front and 8 squares on the back. And they have to write down their scratch work for every single problem on whatever it is that they're working on. And so when it all boils down, I collect all this work. For instance, just for the school year, I have every single piece of scratch work for every single test for 6th through 8th grade on a stack. They're in stack by the unit. Now, I'm not going to say I'm the grades organizer because I haven't organized it by grade level, but I can make sure I can go find their name and what test it is, or I can look at the problems. Because what I may do is I may analyze that later. I may pick up a problem off their own work, and I may project that at random times and let them do error analysis on their own work. Or if they have a test of course, whatever testing software we use, and it tells us that all the kids got number 8 wrong. Okay, what's going to be important to figure out, where did they get number 8 wrong? Did they get it number 8 wrong at the beginning, the middle, or the end of the problem? So then there needs to be some discussion about that. If you just go pick somebody's paper or look at a couple of people, students' papers, and you try to figure out where's the common misconception, you can then again use that as a teaching opportunity. Scratch work, I feel like, is very important. Again, I can also use the scratch work to reflect or revise where we may need to, how we may need to teach it again later on in the year. Come back as a remediation, or the next school year, how do we need to teach this information, how we need to communicate and get it across better than what we did this year. And like I said, I mean, I try to make sure I dump all the scratch work by the end of the school year, unless I have something that I absolutely love. Because yes, of course, I think it's always great to keep, some sample work, just so you can show a student how they have evolved as well. And it's great for your teaching portfolio as well.
I love that. And what I love too, the error analysis, I mean, I love doing activities like that, because I think that alone can change the narrative for students about what it looks like to make a mistake in math. Because when you do that, you're showing one, oh, maybe I made the same mistake. And the problem that you're showing me, I'm like, oh, you know what? I did that too. That makes me feel like I'm not the only person that had that same misconception, or I didn't understand the problem up to that point. And then using the math discourse, like you connected it with the community, talking about how did you approach this problem? What do you see here? And working through that era, it's giving the student information about how they can approach it differently next time. And also the idea that getting it wrong is not the end. It's not the end of it. We can go back and correct that. You can learn how to determine whether your answer might be wrong, or maybe you messed up somewhere, and you can go back and correct that. And so I think that alone is going to create that environment that I made an error, I made a mistake, and I may have gotten the answer wrong, but I can learn from this and I can still recoup some of or all of this problem before I turn in my paper, before I, get to the test. So I love everything that you just said. And so is there anything else you want to add about that before I move on?
Just again, to make sure you just always incorporate that community aspect. Let the kids work together through it, the errors, over you, the teacher, always being the one to correct it.
I think that idea, when again, we're talking about equity and reaching students regardless of gender, socioeconomic status, ethnicity. When we're talking about reaching all students, I think a good way to do that is to make sure you're creating not just building relationships like you talked about, which is good, but also building the community so that students see it as, we all make it when we all do well. And so let me help the person next to me. And so I love that idea.